The story begins with a man who seemed to have everything the world could offer. He was a billionaire, the kind of person people whispered about with both admiration and envy. His name was known in the business world, splashed across magazines, and often spoken about in newsrooms. Wherever he went, the flash of cameras followed him. To many, he was a symbol of success, proof that money and power could buy almost anything. He lived in a mansion so big that it looked more like a palace, drove cars that most people could only dream of, and traveled in private jets as if they were taxis. People admired him, but at the same time, some quietly disliked him because of the way he carried himself. You see, this billionaire had a very strong belief. He thought money was the answer to everything. If a problem came, he believed he could throw some cash at it and it would disappear. If someone stood in his way, he thought his wealth and influence were enough to silence them. Over the years, this attitude gave him confidence, but also a dangerous arrogance. He began to believe he could never lose. Every business deal he made was handled with the same overconfident smile, the same dismissive wave of his hand, and the same proud declaration, "This will be easy." This particular deal was no different. It was $1 million deal. Something small compared to his massive fortune, but still important because it was linked to his reputation. The deal was supposed to expand his empire and secure his dominance in a new market. His team worked hard, studied every detail, and warned him that the people he was negotiating with were not the type to be impressed by flashy wealth. But the billionaire hardly listened. He believed he already knew everything. Why bother listening to his employees or advisors? He was the billionaire after all. He had built an empire, and in his eyes, that meant he was always right. On the day of the negotiation, the billionaire walked into the grand meeting room as if he owned the place. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than what some of his staff earned in a year. He sat at the head of the long table, leaning back in his chair, oozing confidence. His gold watch glistened under the lights, and his tone was sharp but careless, as though he was speaking to people beneath him. He greeted the business partners, but his smile was not one of warmth. It was the smile of a man who thought he already had victory in his pocket. From the very beginning, he underestimated the people sitting across the table. They were seasoned businessmen who valued trust, respect, and long-term vision. But the billionaire was not interested in building relationships. He only wanted to win quickly, to sign papers, shake hands, and announce another triumph to the world. He spoke loudly about his success, about his wealth, about how many companies he had already bought, and how many millions he had made. He thought he was impressing them, but in truth, they were quietly growing annoyed. His arrogance blinded him to the small signs of discomfort around the table, the subtle looks exchanged by the partners, the way their smiles faded as he bragged, the stiffness in their posture. It all went unnoticed by him. Instead, he leaned back further, boasting about how easy this deal was compared to the real challenges he had faced in the past. He even laughed at one of their concerns, waving it off as unimportant. To outsiders, it might have looked like he was in control, but inside the minds of his potential partners, the decision was already forming. They were not going to trust a man who didn't respect them. They were not going to risk working with someone who believed money was the only thing that mattered. The billionaire thought his wealth was a shield that protected him from failure, but in reality, it was becoming the very reason people walked away. What made this part of the story so interesting was how blind the billionaire was to his own mistakes. He thought he was charming, but he came off as arrogant. He thought he was confident, but he appeared careless. He thought he was winning them over, but in truth, he was pushing them away with every word. His laughter, his smug attitude, and his disregard for detail were turning the deal into a disaster, and he didn't even see it coming. For years, this billionaire had lived in a bubble where no one dared to correct him. His staff only nodded, his friends only praised, and his lifestyle only fed his belief that he could never be wrong. But the real world is not so forgiving. Confidence can open doors, but arrogance can slam them shut. and he was about to learn this lesson the hard way. As the meeting dragged on, the billionaire's tone grew sharper, his impatience clearer. He wanted things done fast, signed quickly, celebrated immediately. To him, this was just another trophy deal to add to his collection. But to the people across the table, it was proof that this man did not care about them, their values, or their future. And so, while the billionaire smiled proudly, convinced that he was moments away from another grand victory, he had no idea that his downfall was already beginning. The cracks in his overconfidence were forming, and soon the entire deal would crumble right before his eyes. The negotiation that was supposed to bring the billionaire another shining victory did not begin the way he had imagined. At first, everything looked fine. The conference room was bright, the air smelled of expensive coffee, and the polished table reflected the billionaire's smug smile. He sat tall, leaning back in his chair with the kind of confidence only money can buy. His advisors sat silently beside him, shuffling papers and exchanging nervous glances. They had done their research and knew the people on the other side of the table were not to be underestimated. These were not wide-eyed newcomers impressed by luxury cars and designer suits. They were serious players who valued humility, trust, and careful planning. But the billionaire believed none of that mattered. In his world, money was the only language worth speaking. The meeting began politely enough. Handshakes were exchanged, water glasses were filled, and a few smiles lit the room. The business partners presented their vision, carefully explaining the numbers, the risks, and the rewards. They spoke with respect and detail, hoping to build a sense of mutual trust. But the billionaire was not listening. He nodded half-heartedly, occasionally glancing at his watch as if the whole thing was a waste of his precious time. His mind was already racing ahead to the headlines he imagined. Billionaire secures another $1 million triumph. He was not thinking about the people in front of him. He was thinking about himself. When his turn came to speak, the billionaire's words poured out like a flood. He bragged about his previous deals, his growing empire, and how easily he had crushed competitors in the past. He compared himself to a king who had never lost a battle. "This deal," he declared loudly, "is nothing more than a formality." His laughter echoed across the room, but it did not invite warmth. Instead, it unsettled the partners, who sat stiffly, forcing smiles that quickly faded. As the details of the contract were discussed, problems began to surface. The partners raised concerns about logistics, long-term sustainability, and local community impact. These were serious points, but the billionaire brushed them aside as if they were jokes. "Money solves everything," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I've handled bigger problems than this. Trust me, it's simple." His tone was careless, almost insulting. He did not realize it, but with every word, he was planting seeds of distrust. The partners exchanged quiet glances. Their body language shifted. Some leaned back with folded arms. Others looked down at their notes without meeting his eyes. The billionaire did not notice. He thought he was in control, thought he was dazzling them with his power, but in reality, he was digging his own grave. Then came the breaking point. One of the senior partners, a calm and thoughtful man with decades of experience, politely pointed out a flaw in the billionaire's proposal. It was not an attack, just a suggestion for improvement. But instead of listening, the billionaire laughed mockingly. "I've been doing this longer than you can imagine," he scoffed. "If I say it works, it works. That's the end of it." His words cut through the room like a cold knife. The insult was clear. Respect had been thrown out the window. Silence followed, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a storm about to break. The advisors shifted uncomfortably, wishing their boss would stop talking, but the billionaire pressed on. He raised his voice, bragged more, and even told a few exaggerated stories of past victories. To him, this was strength. To everyone else, it was arrogance on full display. The negotiations slowly unraveled. The partners grew colder, their questions shorter, their answers sharper. What had begun as a friendly conversation turned into a battlefield of pride. The billionaire, blinded by his ego, thought he was winning simply because he was speaking the loudest. He didn't notice that his listeners had already made up their minds. They were pulling away, step by step, minute by minute. By the end of the meeting, the energy in the room was gone. The partners closed their folders, shook hands without enthusiasm, and politely said they would think about it. To the billionaire, this sounded like progress. He smirked, certain that the deal was as good as signed. But to everyone else, it was a clear sign of rejection. They had no intention of moving forward with a man who did not value respect, detail, or cooperation. The advisors knew the truth. They could see the disappointment in the partners' eyes, the stiffness in their body language. The fake smiles meant only to end the conversation politely. But none of them dared to tell the billionaire. He walked out of the room puffed up with pride, still talking about his victory, while his team silently followed, carrying the weight of his mistake. That night, as the news spread through whispers in the business community, the billionaire's reputation began to crack. People spoke quietly but confidently. He's losing his touch. He thinks money is everything, but he doesn't know how to listen. Arrogance will be his downfall. What was supposed to be another shining success became an embarrassment, a public failure for everyone to see. And so, the once confident billionaire found himself standing on the edge of humiliation without even realizing it. His million-dollar deal, which should have been a simple victory, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. But in the shadows of his failure, someone else had been watching closely, someone overlooked, someone underestimated, someone who would soon change everything. The meeting was over, but the billionaire still wore his usual proud smile as he walked out of the grand glass building. He believed the partners were impressed, convinced they were going to call back within hours to seal the deal. He even joked with his assistant about where they would celebrate. "Book the champagne. We'll announce this tomorrow," he said, laughing loudly as though the victory was already written in stone. But what he didn't realize was that the celebration existed only in his imagination. The truth was spreading like wildfire. The business partners, still shaking their heads in disbelief, wasted no time in sharing their side of the story with colleagues. They spoke of arrogance, of disrespect, of how the billionaire had laughed in the face of advice. Word traveled quickly in the business world, and within hours, whispers had turned into conversations. The deal wasn't just dead. It was a public humiliation waiting to happen. At first, the billionaire didn't notice. He continued with his usual routine, luxury dinners, expensive cigars, and boasting about his latest success to his inner circle. But as the days passed, cracks began to appear. His phone calls to the partners went unanswered. Emails were politely ignored. And then, the final blow came. A public statement was released. The statement was short but powerful. The partners had decided to back out of the negotiations. They did not mention names directly, but the message was clear to everyone in the industry. "We believe in collaboration built on trust and respect. Unfortunately, our recent experience has shown a lack of alignment in values, and for that reason, we will not be proceeding." The moment the press got hold of this, the story exploded. Newspapers picked it up, blogs ran with it, and social media lit up with comments. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire's million-dollar deal falls apart. Arrogance cost tycoon his big break." Is this the beginning of his downfall? Overnight, the man who had always been painted as untouchable was being mocked, criticized, and questioned. The billionaire was furious. Sitting in his gold-trimmed office, he threw newspapers across the room, shouting at his staff for letting this happen. "They're lying," he roared. "They don't understand greatness when they see it." But deep down, somewhere in the quiet corners of his mind, he knew the truth. His own arrogance had ruined everything. The humiliation didn't stop there. Investors who once trusted him began to doubt his judgment. If he can't secure such a simple deal, what does that say about his leadership? They whispered in boardrooms. Clients began to hesitate. Partners pulled back, and even some of his most loyal employees started questioning whether the man they followed was really as invincible as he claimed. What made the embarrassment even sharper was the way the story reached ordinary people. The public, who often admired his lavish lifestyle from afar, found themselves laughing at his failure. Memes flooded the internet. Cartoons of a billionaire slipping on banana peels labeled ego, jokes about money not being able to buy respect, and endless comments about karma finally catching up to him. For a man who lived for applause and attention, this sudden shift was like salt on an open wound. One evening, as he attended a high-profile charity event, the embarrassment followed him there too. Normally, people would crowd around him, eager for photos and small talk. But this time, the air was different. Conversations quieted as he entered. Polite smiles replaced genuine excitement, and whispers floated through the crowd. He caught fragments of them. That's him, the one who ruined the deal. All that money but no respect. You can't buy dignity. For the first time in years, he felt small, like a man stripped of his golden armor. Back at his mansion, the weight of the failure grew heavier. He avoided news channels, but still, the headlines found their way to him. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from rivals mocking him, others from supposed friends offering hollow comfort. He poured himself a drink, staring at his reflection in the wide glass windows of his living room. The man looking back at him was not the champion he imagined, but a figure slowly being swallowed by shame. The staff in his house noticed the change too. The once booming laughter had turned into sharp silence. The orders became angrier, shorter, more impatient. Servants whispered among themselves about how quickly fortunes could change. Yet, among them, one man stayed quiet, the black servant who had worked for him for years. Unlike the others, he didn't mock or pity. He simply observed, silently watching his master fall from the pedestal he had built so high. And the billionaire, blinded by his pride, didn't realize that the same servant he barely acknowledged would soon become the key to turning everything around. For now, though, all he could feel was the sting of humiliation. His reputation was in tatters, his empire trembled with doubt, and the very people who once admired him now laughed behind his back. The confident billionaire of yesterday had become the embarrassed man of today, and the world, it seemed, was enjoying every second of his downfall. While the world laughed at the billionaire's failure, life inside his mansion carried on as usual, or at least it appeared that way. The luxurious halls were still polished until they gleamed, the gardens still trimmed with perfect precision, and meals still served on silver trays. But beneath this surface of wealth, something had changed. The air inside the mansion was heavy, filled with tension and unspoken words. Servants whispered about their master's downfall when he wasn't around, laughing quietly at the idea that so much arrogance could collapse so suddenly. Among these servants was a man who did not laugh, mock, or even whisper. He was different. He had worked for the billionaire for many years, moving quietly through the shadows of the mansion. His uniform was simple, his voice soft, and his presence often unnoticed. To most people, he was just a servant, someone who polished shoes, poured drinks, and bowed politely. To the billionaire, he was almost invisible. Rarely did he ever acknowledge him, except when giving sharp commands or impatient gestures. Yet, behind those quiet eyes, the servant saw far more than anyone else realized. He had watched the billionaire rise higher and higher over the years, building his empire on wealth and pride. He had seen the mansions grow larger, the cars faster, and the parties louder, but he had also seen something else. The arrogance that hardened with every success, the blindness to others' advice, and the way respect was replaced by bragging. The servant never said a word, but inside he always knew that one day this arrogance would bring trouble. And now, that day had arrived. When the deal collapsed and the billionaire's reputation cracked, the servant paid close attention. While others mocked, he observed. While others gossiped, he listened. He noticed how the billionaire walked through the halls angrier than ever, apping at employees, slamming doors, and pouring drink after drink late at night. He noticed how his master's once booming laughter was replaced by long silences as he stared out of the tall windows, watching the city lights like a man who no longer knew where he belonged. The servant felt something unusual, sympathy. Most would say he had no reason to feel it. After all, the billionaire had never treated him with respect. He had been invisible for so long that even when he stood near, his master hardly noticed his presence. But the servant did not think like others. He believed in quiet strength, in patience, and in the wisdom that comes from listening more than speaking. And in his silence, he had gathered something priceless: understanding. What the billionaire never realized was that his servant, though dressed in plain clothes and living in the shadows, had a sharp mind and a keen sense of people. He had listened to countless business conversations while pouring tea, polishing tables, or serving drinks. He had learned how deals were made, how trust was earned, and how respect mattered more than numbers on a contract. He had absorbed lessons from the background, unnoticed, like a sponge soaking up wisdom. And now, as the empire around his master trembled, he knew he could see things the billionaire could not. One evening, as the mansion grew quiet and most of the staff had gone to their quarters, the servant walked past the study. Through the half-open door, he saw his master slumped in a chair, his tie loose, his glass half-empty. The man who once carried himself like a king now looked tired, small, and defeated. Papers were scattered across the desk, failed contracts, angry letters, and headlines mocking his downfall. For a moment, the servant hesitated. This was not his place. He was, after all, just a servant. But something inside urged him to stay, to watch, to think. It struck him that for all the wealth, for all the gold and glitter, the billionaire was alone. Money could buy mansions, but not loyalty. Power could buy silence, but not respect. The very people who once cheered for him now turned away, leaving him with nothing but empty trophies and broken pride. The servant thought quietly, perhaps this man needed not more money, but guidance. Not more arrogance, but wisdom. In the days that followed, the servant began to study more closely. He read the mood of his master, noticed the way frustration boiled into anger, and saw opportunities where no one else did. He didn't rush. He didn't speak yet. He simply observed with patience, waiting for the right moment when his quiet voice could finally be heard. The truth was simple, but powerful. The servant was overlooked, underestimated, and invisible. But that invisibility was his strength. Because no one noticed him, he had the freedom to see what others missed. Because no one expected anything from him, he had no pressure to impress. He could watch, listen, and learn in silence. And in that silence, he held a wisdom that not even the billionaire, with all his money and power, could match. The world outside the mansion saw only the billionaire's fall. But inside those walls, a quiet shift was beginning. The servant, Lons, G ignored, was preparing to step out of the shadows. He had no riches, no power, and no name in the business world. But he had something far more valuable: clarity, humility, and the ability to see beyond pride. And soon, he would use it in a way no one could have imagined. The billionaire had no idea yet, but the man he had always overlooked was about to become the one person who could save him. Days passed, and the mansion grew quieter. The billionaire, once the loudest voice in any room, now spent his nights brooding in his study, surrounded by empty glasses and scattered newspapers. His empire was still standing, but his pride had been shattered. Every call he made to recover the $1,000,000 deal ended in disappointment. The partners who once smiled at him now avoided his number. Friends who used to flatter him at parties stopped returning invitations. The louder he tried to assert his power, the emptier the silence around him became. The servants continued their duties as usual, dusting, cleaning, serving food, but everyone could feel the storm in the air. No one dared to speak to him unless spoken to. They feared his temper, feared his mood, and above all, feared being blamed for things they could not control. Everyone kept their distance. Everyone except one. The black servant, who had quietly observed everything for years, saw his master in a way no one else did. He saw not just a rich man, but a man sinking under the weight of his own pride. He saw not just a failed deal, but a lesson waiting to be learned. and for the first time, he began to think about doing something no servant would normally dare to do, offering advice. At first, the idea seemed impossible. How could someone like him, a man with no fortune, no name in the business world, and no position of power, speak to a billionaire about business? It was unthinkable. The billionaire had never asked for his opinion on anything, not even the smallest matters of the house. He was invisible in the eyes of his master, yet something inside pushed him forward. He knew what others did not. He had watched enough, listened enough, and learned enough to see the mistakes clearly. He had the answer his master was searching for, even if the billionaire would never admit it. One evening, as the rain padded softly against the mansion's tall windows, the servant found himself standing outside the study door again. Inside, the billionaire sat hunched over his desk, his head in his hands, staring at the contract that had fallen apart. His face, once proud and commanding, now looked tired and defeated. The servant hesitated, his heart pounding. His hands trembled slightly, but he took a deep breath. If he stayed silent, nothing would change. If he spoke, maybe, just maybe, everything could turn around. He knocked gently on the door. The billionaire lifted his head, irritated. "What is it?" His voice was sharp, though weaker than usual. The servant stepped inside, bowing slightly. "Sir," he said softly, "I know it is not my place, but I believe I may have something useful to say." For a moment, silence hung in the air. The billionaire blinked, confused. Never before had this man spoken beyond the basic duties of his role. He narrowed his eyes. "You? Useful? What could you possibly know about million-dollar deals?" His words were laced with sarcasm, but behind them was exhaustion. The servant didn't flinch. He met his master's eyes with quiet steadiness. "I have been here many years, sir. I have listened. I have watched. And I believe I see the problem that others do not." The billionaire almost laughed, but curiosity stopped him. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Go on then. Amuse me. What great wisdom does a servant have for a man like me?" The servant took a slow breath, steadying his voice. "You lost that deal not because of money, but because of pride. You showed them your wealth, but not your respect. You offered power, but not trust. They wanted a partner. You gave them a master. And no one, sir, not even the most desperate, wants to be treated like a servant in their own house." The words struck the billionaire harder than he expected. He sat in stunned silence. No one had ever spoken to him like this. Not his advisors, not his friends, not even his rivals. Everyone around him had always bowed to his arrogance. And now, here was a man who polished his shoes, daring to tell him the truth. At first, anger rose in him. His pride screamed, "How dare a servant lecture me?" But another voice inside, a smaller, quieter one, whispered, "Is he wrong?" The billionaire remembered the looks on the partners' faces, the coldness in their eyes, the stiffness in their smiles. The servant's words replayed in his mind, fitting perfectly with what had happened. It was as though this invisible man had seen the entire disaster unfold from a clearer perspective than he ever had. "Respect," the billionaire muttered under his breath, almost to himself. He stared at the servant, still unsure whether to be angry or grateful. "And what exactly do you suggest I do now? The deal is gone. The world is mocking me. What solution could someone like you possibly offer?" The servant straightened his back. His voice was calm, yet firm. "You must go back, sir, not with your money, but with humility. Speak to them not as a man above them, but as an equal. Admit where you were wrong. Show them you value their vision as much as your own. Do this, and the door will open again. Do it not, and every door will close to you, no matter how much gold you carry." The billionaire's mouth went dry. No one had ever dared suggest he admit failure, let alone apologize. To him, apologies were signs of weakness. But as he looked into the servant's eyes, he saw no mockery, no ambition, only truth. He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as nonsense. Yet, deep down, he knew. The servant's bold words carried the weight of wisdom, wisdom born not from wealth but from observation, patience, and humility. For the first time in his life, the billionaire considered something extraordinary, listening to someone he had always ignored. And so, what began as a bold suggestion from an overlooked servant would soon become the key to turning the tables on a failure that had humiliated him before the world. The billionaire did not sleep that night. The servant's words echoed in his head again and again, louder than any headline, sharper than any insult he had read in the newspapers. You lost that deal not because of money, but because of pride. They wanted a partner. You gave them a master. He tossed and turned in his silk sheets, staring up at the ceiling. It was strange, almost humiliating to admit, even in his own thoughts, that a servant, of all people, might have been right. For years he had surrounded himself with experts, advisors, and powerful allies, yet none of them had dared to speak the truth so plainly. They sugar-coated his failures, they pampered his ego, they protected his pride. But this servant, who had nothing to gain, had spoken with honesty, and that honesty stung more than the laughter of the world. By morning, the billionaire was restless. He found himself calling the servant back into the study. This time, his tone was softer, not barking with command, but edged with curiosity. "Tell me more," he said. "What else do you see that I do not?" The servant bowed slightly, but his voice was steady. "Sir, you have built an empire with money, but not with people. You believe wealth is enough, but people want respect more than riches. I have watched many men come and go in this mansion, bankers, politicians, investors. Some left with smiles, others with frowns. The difference was never the size of the check. It was how you made them feel." The billionaire frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Feel? This is business, not friendship." The servant shook his head gently. "Business is built on trust, sir. Trust is a feeling. Without it, money is just paper." The billionaire stared at him, torn between disbelief and fascination. He had always believed numbers ruled the world. Profits, shares, percentages. Those were the laws of power. But now, here was a man who polished silver and folded clothes, teaching him that feelings were stronger than figures. Over the next few days, something remarkable happened. The billionaire, for the first time in years, began to listen. He called the servant into the study more often. He asked questions, not about cleaning or serving, but about people. "What do you notice when men sit at my table? What do you think they felt when I spoke at the last meeting? What would you have done differently if you were in my place?" At first, it felt strange, almost uncomfortable, for the servant to answer such questions. But he did, with quiet confidence. He told the billionaire about the subtle signs, the way a guest's smile faded when dismissed, the way hands tightened when interrupted, the way silence grew when arrogance filled the room. He spoke not with theory, but with observation, with years of unnoticed wisdom collected in silence. The billionaire listened carefully. Each word was like a mirror held up to him, showing truths he had long ignored. He began to realize how blind he had been, how much he had relied on money as a crutch, how little he had valued respect. One evening, the servant gave him a simple but powerful piece of advice. If you wish to win them back, do not speak first. Let them speak. Listen, not to answer, but to understand. When they see you value their words, they will value yours. The billionaire, who was used to dominating every room with his voice, was stunned. "You mean, I should be silent?" "Yes, sir," the servant replied calmly. "Sometimes silence is the loudest voice." The billionaire thought about it deeply. Silence had never been his weapon. He had always believed in filling rooms with his presence, his laughter, his boasting. But perhaps that was why the rooms had grown cold. The change did not happen overnight, but slowly he began to practice. At meetings with his staff, he resisted the urge to interrupt. He forced himself to listen, to nod, to ask questions instead of giving orders. At first, his employees were shocked. Some thought it was a trick, others were nervous. but soon they began to open up. They shared ideas they had kept hidden, solutions they had been too afraid to mention. And for the first time, the billionaire realized how much wisdom had been buried under his arrogance. Word spread quietly within the mansion too. The staff, who once tiptoed in fear, noticed the shift. He greeted them with small nods. He asked names he had never cared to know. He thanked them for simple tasks. It wasn't much, but it was different. And difference, no matter how small, is the beginning of change. The servant, however, remained humble. He never claimed credit, never asked for recognition. He simply guided, offering wisdom when asked, staying silent when not. But deep inside, he knew his advice was reshaping something greater than just a man's manners. It was reshaping the way this billionaire saw the world. Outside, the business world still whispered, still mocked, still doubted. But inside, a quiet transformation was taking place. A man who once believed himself untouchable was slowly learning the power of humility, the strength of listening, and the unseen wisdom of those the world often ignores. The billionaire didn't say it loud, but for the first time in his life, he began to respect the man he once thought invisible. He began to see him not as a servant, but as a teacher hidden in plain sight. And though the world did not know it yet, this unseen wisdom was about to turn a public humiliation into a story of redemption that no one could have predicted.